So, good morning, everyone. I'll just walk you through a presentation that I have put together in light of the issues we're discussing. Is this working? No, that's the. I'm going to click. Okay. So the question that was posed, your question was, does climate change has an impact on the movement of people? And so the intuitive answer is yes, but I think it's important to try to dig it out. And so I wanted to walk you through my findings that are not, fully conclusive, but I'm happy to share my results, and then we can have a conversation over that, hopefully. But in order to do so, as the audience here is not people who are working with migration on a daily basis, except Joachim, I just wanted to give you 3 slides of definitions so that we know what we're talking about. So in migration, we're distinguishing between international migration. That's what we usually think. A migrant is somebody born in one country, living in another country. And the standard definition of the UN is that you need to move for more than 12 months in order to qualify as a migrant. So seasonal labor usually is not counted. Exchange students, Erasmus people going back and forth. And then internal migration, so that's people moving between provinces. And then we are trying to distinguish reasons like voluntary migration and forced migration. So in the case of climate change, we assume it would not be a voluntary but a forced migration. And the definition of migrants includes people who are asylum seekers who are recognized refugees, because it's assumed that they live in one country and have been born in another country. The UNHCR definition also includes Palestinians who have never moved from one country to another, if they fall under the UNRWA mandate, so people in Gaza or in Lebanon without citizenship of Lebanon. But that's another story. They are included in the UNHCR figures, but they usually, they are not migrants because most of them were not alive in 1948 when the initial expulsion from Israel took place. The other type of reasons is something that doesn't distinguish between voluntary and forced, but distinguishes the motives, or the gates of entry as defined by the receiving countries, like work or employment. So if somebody gets a work permit, education, family reunion, the most important feature of family reunion for non-refugee population is marriage. So you get married to someone who lives in another country and then you move there. Asylum or humanitarian protection, and retirement migration that you find. When you go to the south of Spain or to Madeira or the Canary Islands, you find Northern Europeans retiring there just as people move to Florida inside the US for retirement. So obviously climate is not a feature in this category that we usually apply. So the Geneva Convention doesn't have climate on its list. So if your country disappears in the Pacific Ocean and you have nowhere to go, this is not seen as political persecution, and so you don't qualify under the existing rules as for refugee status. Also, deportation, if you are termed to be an irregular migrant in Sweden, becomes very difficult if your country no longer exists on the map, or maybe still on the map, but not physically. So, there's a whole lot of questions that are implied here that the next generation of migration policymakers will have to address. Now, conceptually, I think the main distinction is between stocks and flows. And this is where the most confusion gets when we're talking about people. So the stock of people is how many people live in one country, are born in another. The flow is how many people have recently moved. Usually we look at a 12-month period, but we can also look at 5 years or 10 years, something like that. So the stock is here, the flow is a recent movement. And so then the question is, do we have data on that? And we don't have data readily available for how many people have moved last year from, I don't know, Burkina Faso to the Ivory Coast, or how many people have moved exactly from into the UK, because the UK doesn't have a population register, or so that's more based on a guesstimate. But still we have data, but they are not precise. Whereas a country like Sweden has a population register, so you at least legal immigration to Sweden should be documented to the last digit on a, I don't know, 5-digit, I don't know, 20,000, 30,000, 100,000 people. You would know by the last number how many it was. So this really depends on the data situation. Now, I'm starting with the stock. And so this is the question: how many people do live outside their country of birth? And so when we go back to the 1990s, we see it was assumed to be 150 million, and it has increased to the year 2017 to an estimated figure of 258 million people. This is data that comes from the UN Population Division. They are calculating this. They have methods how to estimate. And so this is an aggregate estimate. Some of the data are pretty valid when it comes to Sweden. Some of the data are pretty guesstimates when it comes to Ivory Coast or to Nigeria or to South Africa. Now, it appears this is a clear increase, but it appears to be linked to more migration. And this is not necessarily the case. There is also two other factors that increase the number of migrants. The one is if there's fewer returns, so less mobility leads to a larger stock of migration. This is counterintuitive, but that's the case. So if fewer people of migrant origin are leaving Sweden, then you have more migrants living in Sweden. And the other fortunate or unfortunate thing is high longevity. Sweden has one of the highest life expectancies in the world. So if every migrant would die the next day after arrival, I mean, not many people would migrate if this would be known, but if, think of a hypothetical case, every migrant would die the next day, we could have a huge flows of migration, but no stock. Yeah? And so the fact that people tend to go to places where they live longer than they would have lived at home increases the number of migrants without having actually more people moving across borders. And then something that I have not included here, and that's why it's difficult to go beyond in the past, the more sovereign states we have, the more migrants we have. If Finland and Sweden would still be one country, as it was a bit more than 200 years ago, we would have fewer migrants in the world, because all the Finns living in Sweden would be domestic, internal movers. I don't know, the Soviet Union would still exist, we would have maybe 15 to 20 million fewer migrants, because all the ethnic Russians who have moved from the Baltic states to Russia or from Kazakhstan to Russia would still be internal migrants. So if former Yugoslavia would still be around, probably 1 million less or something like that. So we have also to account for the number of sovereign states that create statistically migrants, despite the fact that maybe they have moved in time. So there's plenty of ethnic Russians in Estonia and Latvia. Most of them have come before Estonia and Latvia became independent. They didn't even have a clue. They became international migrants on the day of independence of Estonia and Latvia, not on the day they were moving. At least when you want to decipher statistics, it's important to do that. So we have 258 million people living outside their country of birth in 2017, an estimate of the UN. And this looks large. So this is half the population of the EU, but it's only 3.4% of the planetary population. So let's not fool ourselves. I mean, cannot say, when I'm asking audiences who are not very much informed people, the usual guess is about between 20 and 30%, that people think on the move. So most migrants remain inside their macro region. So in Africa, most African migrants have moved from one African country to another. In wider Europe also, from one European country to another. In Asia, the same. The only exception is Latin America, where most migrants from Latin America have moved to the US and Canada, and so that's outside their continent. But that is how you depict. You can say the Americas is one continent, and the Panama Canal is not a clear division. And the division as the UN does it in America is not between North and South America, but it's between the poorer part, which is called Latin America, and the richer part, which is called Northern America. But geographically, Mexico is part of Northern America. And the Mexico-US corridor is the most important single migration corridor in the world. But that's between neighboring countries. Where do migrants end up? There is a clear tendency ever more in richer countries. So if you want to tell a story of migration, you would say 18th and 19th century, people are moving from richer parts of the world to poorer ones. Migration goes from rich Europe to poor Americas. Yeah? The living standards, when the Pilgrim Fathers arrived from England in what would later become the Commonwealth of Massachusetts today, you can be pretty sure that the GDP per capita in England was higher than in Massachusetts. Or when people moved from Portugal to Brazil, the living standards in Portugal were higher than in Brazil. So it also sounds counterintuitive, but these people were hoping that they would become rich individually, but they were not going to richer parts of the world, GDP-wise. So that's settlement migration, 18th, 19th century out of Europe. The first part of the 20th century is basically people displacement. World War I, World War II, Greece, Turkey, partition of India, Israel, Palestine. So basically it was not labor migration, it was people forcibly displaced because of the redrawing of borders and of the impact of National Socialism and Stalinism. In the second part of the 20th century, we are back to labor migration, and there you see people going from poorer parts of the world to richer ones. So it's the inverse of what we had in the colonization process. And so that's important. What this is the product of this. We see people going from poorer parts of the world to richer ones, and this is why we have ever more migrants living in richer parts of the world. You see in the year 2000, 173 million migrants assumed, stock, 58% in richer high-income countries. 2017, 17 years later, already 64% of a number that is 80 million higher than 70 years ago. So and rich does not only mean the US, Canada, Europe, and Australia, it also means the Gulf states or Singapore to be included here. So this was stocks. Now look at flows. And I just give you two slides to remember. The one is how many people are moving per year. And then when you go back to the 1960s, you see it was 5 to 6 million people a year. And today we have something between 7 and 9 million people a year moving actually for a period of more than 12 months from one country to another, changing their premises. So that's a lot more, but also world population has increased. And this is why you can say that the likelihood of migration has not increased over the last 70 years. We are at 1 person per 1,000 per year who is moving from one country to another. In the 1960s, in the 1970s, in the 1980s, in the 1990s, in the early 2000s, in the last 10 years as well. No change. It looks like a universal constant, but I cannot provide you any explanation for that. But the chances that someone moves from one country to another is almost the same, has almost not changed over the last 70 years. And that's important to note when you want to explain migration. That the main driver of having more migrants is on the one side a higher population on the globe, and on the other hand, people living longer in the country of destination. So when we look at migration and development, which is the big push, and everybody talks about it, people coming across the Mediterranean in an irregular manner, not easy to send them back. So we need to develop the poorer countries in our neighborhood and maybe beyond, but we have a particular eye on our neighborhood for obvious and partly selfish reasons. We need to develop the livelihoods there. And it's important to at least have one graph in mind, and it's this one, which says which percentage of the population of a sending country is living abroad. And there you see, in very poor countries, this percentage is very small. So almost nobody emigrates from a poor country. Countries are getting richer, and according to GDP per capita, so you can assume that also more people are getting richer in these countries. It's an average. So up to a threshold of maybe 10,000 euros or dollars GDP per capita per year, the amount of people living outside the country emigrating is increasing. And after that threshold, it's decreasing. So you can see Sweden in the 16th century probably was here, not many Swedes living abroad. Sweden getting a little bit richer in the 19th century, plenty of Swedes moving abroad, and this stopped somewhere in the first half of the 20th century, and Sweden becoming even more wealthy, and the Swedes, and then you see a reverse of flows, people moving to Sweden. So the Finns were the first, if I remember this correctly historically, but today when you go to the streets of Stockholm, you see people from all parts of the world living here in Sweden, so we are here. Yeah? There are still Swedes living outside their country of birth, including some of my colleagues in Brussels, so that's a full cycle. And that's the future of Africa. So we start investing in Africa, the more people will come to Europe. We invest for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, maybe we reach here, 60 years. So already at the end of the 21st century, our investments will bear fruit, and we'll see a reversal of trends and maybe fewer people living. So this narrative is important because, the narrative is important because today we are sitting in Brussels and politicians from other European countries are coming and saying, do something about immigration from Africa, invest more there. But the hope is that investing today will lead to fewer migrants next year, in a year from now, 2 years from now. And I think we need to push this back. It's totally naive, and it leads to doing the right thing for the wrong reasons. And if the flows will not recede, then in 2 years the same people will come and say, take the money away from the Africans because flows have not receded, so let's invest somewhere else. Yeah, now we need more battery factories in Europe, or I don't know, something like that. Yeah, so that's I wanted to make that clear as a prerequisite. So development goes that. First, it leads to more immigration, and then it leads to less immigration. Now, let's move to displacement. So I start with the UNHCR figures. These are registered refugees or refugees recognized in an asylum procedure. It's either or. So in Kenya, for example, this is Ethiopia, this is Kenya, this is Uganda. So in Kenya here, for example, or in Ethiopia, there's no asylum procedure. People are clustering, get registered by UNHCR, maybe get some benefits or at least tents, and in Kenya, we have Dadaab, a huge refugee camp in northeastern Kenya. And so you become a refugee by being registered by UNHCR. Doesn't give you access to welfare or citizenship of the country where you reside. In Europe, we have asylum procedures, so UNHCR is not involved, but it's the signatory to the Geneva Convention, the sovereign signatory to the Geneva that does the asylum procedure. There you have a different trajectory because refugees get rejected or recognized. UNHCR doesn't take sides. Yeah, so they just register people. Whether it's warranted or not, it's not something that UNHCR gets mingled. When the Swedish authorities are involved, they decide whether someone is deemed to be a genuine refugee or not. So that's the figures. We have, according to UNHCR, at the end of 2018, we had 20.4 million international migrants deemed to be refugees. So when you can weigh this against the figures that we have seen before, 558 million, maybe at the end of 2018, we already had 265 or 270 million international migrants. You can say about 7% of the world's migrant population are refugees, about 7%. So this is asylum. You can ask for asylum, but not many countries would accept asylum claims or asylum procedures. Yeah, when I go back so this is Ethiopia. You have seen how large the refugee population is. When you look at the asylum, you see that that's not a relevant gate of entry into the refugee status in these countries. In Germany or in Turkey, it's the opposite. You have large refugee populations, but they are people who have gone through some sort of an asylum procedure or screening. So there's not many places in the world where you can actually get asylum. We're talking about the US and Canada, Europe, plus Turkey, maybe South Africa. Basically, that's it. Yeah. Emerging Peru. So we have about 2.5 million refugees from Colombia, from Venezuela. The vast majority is in Colombia, but Colombia is not doing refugee recognition through asylum procedures. So the total number is 3.5 million. This needs to be added to the 20.4 million. So this brings us to about 24 million people who are either recognized or registered refugees or people in the asylum procedure. Still way below 10% of the global population of migrants. And so we are talking about 0.3% of the world population. 0.3%. Where do refugees come from? So Syria today is by far the largest sending country. And so we're talking about stocks, not about people who have moved in 2018. This is just the stock, comparing the stock year end 17 to the stock year end 18. Afghanistan, South Sudan, Myanmar, so that's a Rohingya, Somalia, Sudan, Congo, Central African Republic, Eritrea, and Burundi. So you have not looked it up, but if you compare probably the Swedish refugee population, it would be interesting to see what kind of bias you're having. Above average Syrians or above average Afghans or so. Some countries like Austria, the Afghan population is taking over, so there's now more inflows from Afghanistan than from Syria. Then we have 2.5 million Venezuelans missing, but that has to do with the fact that most of them have been going to countries where they cannot be registered, like Colombia. And then where do people end up? So Turkey, Pakistan. Turkey, it's obvious, that's people from Syria, from Iraq, but also increasingly Afghanistan and Iran. Pakistan, that's Afghanistan. Uganda, that's South Sudan, but also a little bit of Congo and Chad. People ending up there. Sudan, from South Sudan, but also from Eritrea. Germany, so that's mostly Syrians, Afghans, and Iraqi, and so on. Colombia is missing as it doesn't register the people, but we would have 1.2 million people from Venezuela residing in Colombia today. When you look at the stocks, this is what UNHCR is publishing. The gray zone is the UNHCR recognized and registered or Geneva Convention refugees. So this has about doubled over the last 10 years. The greenish part is the asylum seekers. Their number has tripled, but this has to do with delays in the asylum procedure. The yellow part, which is included, but it's not refugees, it's not international migrants, is the Palestinians under the UNRWA mandate. They are mixed into it a little bit in a way to make the figures a little bigger. So the UNHCR publication somehow is also a kind of a mission statement in disguise to open our hearts and wallets. And then the bluish part is the internally displaced people caused by political violence. Now, what's missing here is displacement because of climate change and extreme weather conditions. And if you ask yourself, why does UNHCR not put these people into the same basket? Because they don't want a mandate for them. Because the fear is then these people would also need to get money from UNHCR, and UNHCR thinks it's already thinly spread. This is why climate refugees are not included in UNHCR figures. And this is why almost nobody talks about them, because there is no international organization drumming up support. Because when you look at newly internally displaced people in the year 2018, so yellow is conflict, blue is disasters of all kinds, but mainly nature. I will show you this in a second. You see, yes, there's plenty of newly displaced people as a result of conflict, but apparently there's more people who get displaced because of so-called natural disasters. Yeah? And so here we no longer rely on UNHCR data. There's an international displacement monitoring center in Geneva which provides us with these data. And then when you break it down, you see total displacement in the year 2018 is internal displacement is 28 million people. So that's more than the total global refugee and asylum stock has been newly displaced in the year 2018 domestically. And you see that about 60% is so-called natural disasters. But when you break down the natural disasters, you see the geophysical disasters. So earthquakes, volcano eruption, and tsunamis is about 5 to 7%. And the rest is extreme weather conditions. And at least among people working here, I do not have to make the argument that extreme weather conditions might be related to climate change. Where does this take place? So we see the conflict-related new displacement in 2018 is Ethiopia, linked to the democratization process. The more Ethiopia gets democratic, the more people get displaced, because you have more political parties now struggling for influence. The Democratic Republic of Congo and Syria, which is clearly related to the Assad regime trying to get into northwestern Syria, entering Idlib, so getting a grip on the stronghold where you still have Islamic fighters and Democrats assembled there. Disaster-related displacement, the Philippines, this is floods. China, basically floods. India, same story. The US, these are hurricanes. So when you look at the timeline, you see there is not a clear trend. You can see disaster-related internal displacement has its ups and downs. The conflict and violence related have been going up over the last 10 years from an average of maybe 5 to an average of maybe closer to 10 million per year, every year. But when you take the blue lines and you sum up this, you can say 200 million people on our planet have been displaced for natural disaster related, and I would say mostly climate change related events over the last 10 years. And we always talk about these people. We almost never talk about these people. It's interesting that migration research or international protection discussions and where to put our money and shall we do resettlement, relocation, whatever, it's always here. Yeah? It's almost never here. So you see how important it is to have a voice and an international organization inside the UN that cares. So let's move to climate change. You know a lot more than I do. We don't know exactly where it's going, so there's a wide range of projections depending on the greenhouse gas emissions that are yet to come. And so the big difficulty is to say what will be the displacement effect this has. And you can be pretty sure that even in a range of only 30 years, being here makes probably a huge difference when it comes to displacement. But that's something where we would need a fruitful discussion between you and me. Now, this is a natural science view. There's indices that tell you or give you vulnerability index to climate change. And this is 50 times 50 kilometers, squares that are made, and my colleagues at the Joint Research Center of the European Commission in ISPRA is doing this. So they're doing assessments for 50 times 50 kilometer squares globally on different things. And so they try to assess the vulnerability and the exposure to climate change. It's a purely natural science view. Then we have an economist view, economists trying to calculate what's the impact on GDP. So if it's getting warmer, GDP in Siberia will increase, and GDP, I don't know, in Sudan will decrease. So that's but also depending on in which scenario we are, how much hotter it's going to get. So the benefits for Greenland becoming green again and becoming a powerhouse of global farming or something like that will be larger if it's getting hotter soon, smaller if it's not getting hotter soon, something like that. You have that kind of impact, yeah, that is assumed. Tibet, yeah, hope for Tibet, finally it's getting warmer. Yeah, you can have more cows or yaks or whatever, create more milk from and butter from yaks. I don't know, things like that. That's the assumptions behind that my colleagues are having. And that's a capital markets view, which is often overlooked, but that's the assumption of Moody's on the sovereign debt rating of a particular country. Not all countries are having that. Some countries are not able to issue sovereign debt in the first place. And so the assumption is on some countries' rating, it will have no impact, and in other countries, it will have a negative impact. I didn't find a positive impact, but I mean, you can maybe Russia, yeah, will have a positive impact. But at least the assumption is between neutral and negative. That's a capital markets point of view. So that's totally different from the natural science. Not totally, but there is a political and financial mitigation ability assumption built into that. Yeah, before. So you have the natural science view, and then you see how well is a country or institutionally and economically prepared to cope with it. And so even if you're exposed, like when you look at climate change maps, you see that the western part of the US, southwestern part of the US is heavily exposed, but you don't assume it has a huge impact internationally because the US will be able to cope with it. Yeah? So climate-related risk factors that could possibly influence migratory movements, so that's food supply. There again, you see a vulnerability or risk index here. And there is projections how climate change might affect the production of food in the future. And I mean, no wonder the countries that are most exposed to climate change from a natural science point of view are assumed to have a negative impact on their ability to produce food. Now in Africa, this becomes particularly interesting because we are assuming that the population of Africa will be quadrupling within the next 80 years. And so there's an interesting gap on food security that opens up here. Less available water. Here we have two dimensions. The one is there is physical water scarcity, like in Saudi Arabia, for example, or in the southwest of the US. And then they have put an economic dimension, so there is the institution set up in this country is not prepared to provide water. Because some of us might already have been in Arizona or in Las Vegas. So not much water there, but there is swimming pools and there is fountains and there is plenty of water when you open the tap in your hotel, and you can buy bottled water, things like that. So there is an institution set up to cope with it, at least today, maybe not forever. But in Africa, there are certain areas where there's plenty of water, like in the Democratic Republic of Congo, but the institution set up that does not deliver fresh drinking water to the population at the scale, at least, that would be deemed to be sufficient. So there's the two dimensions. So there's not enough water, or the wrong type of water, or too much water, yeah, which is the rising sea level assumption. So I've put here together a map that I downloaded where you see coastal populations that are susceptible to be exposed to rising sea levels. About 40% of the world population is living near coasts, not necessarily at the coast, but near coasts. This has to do with international trade routes, developing in the past, and the lack of food supply over land, so that shipping food was always easier than taking it with a horse or on your back. And this is why major cities are along the coast. Sweden is a good example, yeah, when you look at Stockholm or at Gothenburg or Malmö. So also in Sweden you have basically the population concentrated along the coast. Finland the same, Norway. Yeah, so that's the US is not different in that account. And even if it's not along the coast, like in Chicago, it's on a big lake. So there's a water-related issue with settlement pattern in Europe and in North America, and also in Africa and in Asia. And so the vulnerability is higher. And when you look at the map of flooding today, you already see in Asia or in sub-Saharan Africa, between 75 and 90% of flood victims live in urban areas. So we can already see it. It's not just a projection about the future. Getting warmer. So here is a map that gives you probably know a lot more about it, the number of days in a particular region that are above, I don't know where it's put, the threshold, probably 48 or 50 degrees Celsius outside temperature. And you see, depending on which scenario we are about the future, at the end of the century, it could be up to or more than 300 days a year. So not easy to understand how people will manage to live in such a place in the future. And that's the Amazon basin, parts of Central America, the Western African coast, the Congo basin, and the Swahili coast, just to give you all of Southeast Asia when it comes to Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, etc. Then we have desertification. So that's also a risk. You can see you can cope with it. Like in the US, it will probably not lead to major disruptions. There will be probably a little bit less food production in certain parts of the US. It can have a huge impact when you look at Central Asia. Two non-climate related risks that need to be taken into account. The one is political fragility, which could be increased because of climate change. And then we have demographic change, and the regions that are mostly affected here by any type of climate change assumed, which is Sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. Asia are the two places where we will have the largest absolute increase in population between now and the end of the 20th century. So we can assume a quadrupling in Sub-Saharan Africa, and we can assume at least in Bangladesh and India and Indonesia and the Philippines at least 40% more than we have today. So I just finish with a little bit food for discussion from my daily work. So that's, for example, a heat wave in June 2019 in India. So we get data, there's a daily data, that's just a single day, how many people have died. Was not a lot. A single heat wave doesn't lead to a lot of displacement. A single heat wave once a month, maybe more. A single heat wave every week over a period of 4 months probably would lead to people considering moving. Yeah? So today we have people dying from it, but not moving around. Monsoon floods in India. Here we have displacement figures for the different most affected regions here. So the total displacement in September 2019 was 1.6 million people displaced in India within a period of about 10 days because of monsoon floods. Doesn't spill into other countries. So that's domestically displaced people. But it adds to these 200 million people who have been displaced over the last 10 years for so-called natural disasters and climate-related events. Same in Southeast Asia. So that's the same week, monsoon period. So the displacement, the internal is small, but there it could go across international boundaries just because the countries are smaller and the neighboring countries are more. So largest number in Thailand, so that's unlikely that you decide to move from rich Thailand to poorer Laos or Cambodia. In Laos, it could just be the opposite. There we had 100,000 people displaced, so maybe, I don't know, if opportunities are better across the border, maybe. So maybe. We had unusually heavy rainfalls in Sudan in August this year. And there you see a mix, already 2 million refugees in Sudan, and you have a total displacement that was in the thousands or tens of thousands, depending on where you are. So we're talking about maybe 180, 190,000 people within the month of August. And that adds to a population that is already hosting 2 million refugees. So it's a combination of the two that might make it more difficult. I don't think that Sudan cannot cope with 200,000 displaced people within 2 or 3 weeks, but when it adds up to an already fragile situation. And this was in the midst of a constitutional and government crisis, so no clear division of responsibilities. Makes it more difficult. Uganda, earlier this year, a small type of polycrisis. So if 1.1 million refugees hosted by Uganda, we have an emerging drought on northeastern Uganda bordering Kenya, and we had the outbreak of Ebola in eastern Congo with a potential spill into Uganda across the border. So that's a kind of situation where when you have a mix, if the Ebola would start here, it would be even more disastrous. Because refugees usually live in camps or closer together, so the possibility that the disease spreads is higher than we have it in a more thinly populated area, like we have in northeastern Congo, for example. Yeah? So we have 1.2 million refugees, and we had about 3,000 Ebola cases in eastern Congo at the same time here. Another polycrisis, when you look at the upper area of the Niger River, we see a mix of displacement, international migration, terrorism, flight, food insecurity. So the color of the map shows you the food insecurity between January and August 2019. So we are all maps are from my daily work this year. You see new flight or displacement across borders, new displacement inside borders. So between January and August 2019, 234,000 newly internally displaced people in Mali, and 54,000 trying to move into Niger. We have a similar situation here. Burkina Faso newly displaced, but also people moving from Mali to Niger, to Burkina Faso. And then we have a terrorist threat. So the bars here are places where we have a state of emergency declared. Could be for food insecurity, could also be for security reasons, because we have guerrilla groups, opposition fighters, armed groups moving around, which leads to a local curfew. Yeah. Polycrisis in South Sudan, you have a mix of civil war, food insecurity, displacement, and refugee population. Yeah. So Ethiopia hosting 367,000 refugees from South Sudan, Uganda 0.7 million, Sudan 800,000. So there's plenty of people abroad, but you see also South Sudan is hosting refugees and internally displaced people. And then you have a situation where you have acute food security. So we're talking about the earlier period, February to April 2019, so the winter a year ago, or earlier this year, a polycrisis in Central America where you have a mix between shortage of food and local violence, usually not politically motivated, but gangs going after each other's, and that or trying to control narco smuggling lines. And so that's partly behind these, lines of people trying to walk literally from Central America to the US-Mexican border. But also see 60,000 Nicaraguans who have been asking for asylum in neighboring Costa Rica. But at the same time, in 2018, we had about 400,000 people from Central America who have attempted to cross the US-Mexican border. Whatever. So let me finish by saying today most people displaced by climate change, and there's a lot, do not leave their country. Many of them are even able to go back to the place from which they were displaced after a week, a month, a year, depending on the level of destruction. Yeah? But what could happen tomorrow is a deteriorating of livelihoods that would force people to look not only for domestic alternatives, but for alternatives abroad. So you could easily see more people from Bangladesh moving to Assam and West Bengal. Similar language, same names, probably family ties. So it's just used to be a religious division, not an ethnic or geographic one that created East Pakistan, which is now Bangladesh, to give you an example. Extreme weather conditions could lead to mass displacement that are spilling into other countries. I've shown you the monsoon displacement this year in Southeast Asia, Indochina. So that's you can easily make the argument here. There's political conflict that could be induced by competition over scarce resources, so that climate change leads to political conflict, and it's the political conflict that displaces people. So there's an indirect effect of climate change. And then you can have regimes that are unable to cope, encouraging part of their citizens to leave. Because that's the situation now that we're having in many countries of the world. In a world where, I don't know, at least Joachim and I grew up with iron curtains and walls preventing people, you had regimes who tried to protect themselves against the emigration of people. This is no longer the case. North Korea is probably the only country that really tries to effectively prevent its citizens from leaving. Today it's the opposite. Yeah? Most regimes have an open door policy when it comes to their own citizens, and they are happy if they're leaving, because every citizen who lives abroad creates income from remittances, but there's also one unemployed and unhappy person less at home, which also usually has a positively stabilizing effect on regimes if all those who are unhappy are abroad. That's almost an ideal situation. And so this could become more important. Yeah, so Afghanistan, for example, the government of Afghanistan is issuing passports with biometric data, which gives you more freedom to travel at a high rate. So, I don't know, maybe 1 million passports a year, something like that. It's an interesting source of income for these countries also. So that contributes. For the moment, it's more related to economic and political situations, but it could also be in the future that we're doing that. I would want to thank you again for the invitation, and would be happy if there is one or two more questions to answer them readily. Thanks so much.
Before we take comments from everybody or questions, we have two reflections, one by Joachim and one by Francesca. Would you like to start, Francesca? Francesca Rossignoli. I introduced her before you arrived, but she's at the political science department here at Stockholm University, a postdoc working on climate and migration issues.
Thank you so much for your.
Maybe you want to come here so that people can see you who are live on the stream.
Okay, so thank you so much for your presentation. I'm also working on this topic, and actually my research is more in the from a legal perspective concerning climate refugees, or whether we can consider people forced to migrate because of the impacts of climate change as refugees, or rather migrants. And so the comments that I would like to add to your presentation is that basically it's true that there is an economic challenge in order to include this new category, let's say, of forced migrants, because, as you mentioned before, UNHCR doesn't have enough resources to cope with all those people. But there are also some legal obstacles if we look at the definition that we have. So basically, they don't meet any requirements provided for the convention. So they don't meet, for instance, persecution, and even the 5 reasons for persecution that are listed into the existing law. So what I think is that the only thing that we can do to solve this problem is probably to provide a broader interpretation on who are refugees. And basically we can provide a new interpretation that is based on a new geopolitical context. I think that we are not into the context of the Cold War, but in the context of hot wars. And as you mentioned before, there are 2, let's say, tension belts, I think. Not only the equatorial belt, as you showed in your presentation, but also the polar tension. So even in the Antarctica and all those places, there is a kind of potential conflicts that will that we could have in the future, like a land of opportunities. And if we see Trump, he wanted to buy Greenland. So so my question is whether you see a specific room for climate-induced migration or climate refugees. I don't know which is your position. If you think it is more promising to frame people forced to migrate because in the impact of climate change in terms of migrants or in terms of refugees. That is my question.
So shall I answer immediately, or
Yeah, sure.
do we want to give the floor to Joachim first? Or
You can
okay.
collect them, that's fine. Yeah, okay. Thank you. Okay.
So thank you very much, Rainer, for this very thought-provoking display of the state of the world migration, and also for pointing to some of the, basic policy challenges that are confronting us, and also with the projections that we have for climate change, that these issues will not go away. So I have some pretty basic reflections about what the possibility is to do something about this pressing situation for the now internally displaced persons that have been displaced from climate, but potentially also from climate-induced conflicts, and what kind of morality that is in that. But then the next thing that is likely to happen is that this internally displaced flows of people will spill over and will spill over to the neighboring countries and neighboring countries that are also poor, and that it will take a while until these flows will have an effect on Europe or the other rich countries, as you mentioned, are increasingly the hosts or receiving countries of those who seek refugee for conflict reasons. And here, what seems to be a real challenge is that we have now a Geneva Convention that is in place, but and it's increasingly contested and contested for different reasons. But one of the reasons is that it's sort of used by others than those who have the right to asylum. So the denial rates are huge, and this is then making it very difficult to open new doors in such a regime. So it's from a sort of the present sort of political situation, not only in Europe but also in North America. It's very difficult to see that there will be another door opening. So isn't it then more of a sort of development aid, sustainable development goals issue to come up with policies that can address the vulnerabilities of these people, so that they too can find sustainable livelihoods. If it's not possible to move back, maybe in where they have now been placed, or where they may appear in the future across one or two borders in neighboring countries, and that this is about sort of basic access to sort of fundamental services such as education and healthcare. And if we're thinking about sort of policies that may both sort of have some relation to our moral obligation to deal with the kinds of climate-induced displacement that related to our own behaviors, but at the same time not immediately mobilizing sort of anti-liberal interest that would block any attempt to open doors to Europe.
Thank you for these questions and considerations. So when we look at the history of the Geneva Convention, we see that the Geneva Convention has been broadened since its drafting in the 1940s in two ways. First, the Geneva Convention, the people who drafted the Geneva Convention never thought that non-white, non-European people would ever fall under this convention. It was meant to target so-called noble refugees, basically in the East-West conflict the liberal opposition to communism, and to give a door to them. The idea that you would be mistreated by the Belgian authorities in Congo in the 1950s and then would find asylum in Paris or Brussels was not even considered. We were not the people of concern of the people who have been drafting the Geneva Convention. And so since the 1960s, we have seen a gradual opening and an extension or a lifting of this geographic reservation, which is a big shift. Whether you think you are responsible for the Eastern European victims of communism, or whether you think you are responsible for, people coming from countries you never heard of, involved in conflicts that you have no clue about. is a big step. And the other shift that we have seen in the Geneva Convention is a shift in the interpretation from individual persecution, that you see the KGB or the East German Stasi is going after you, to I'm living in an area of conflict and I fear that this might affect me negatively. Yeah, and that's a big change. So if you come from Syria today, you don't have to prove that you were you were in an immediate danger. Yeah, the fact that you come from a civil war-torn area where the government goes after its own citizens is enough to give you access to refugee status. But it's like with East-West migration prior to the fall of the Iron Curtain. Some motives of these people might also well be economic. Yeah, they want to have a better life outside Syria. I'm not saying that's illegitimate, but the gate of entry is defined as a political one. Now, and there I would follow Joachim Palmer's considerations. I do not think that there is any popular majority available in Europe or in the US or in Australia or in a few other countries to extend the Geneva Convention further. The danger is rather if one would do an open government consultation of the type of global compact or something like that to amend the Geneva Convention, that the definition of a new Geneva Convention would rather be narrower, or the interpretation would become narrower, not more extensive. That's the number one thing. The number two thing, where's the urgency? There is not a large number of climate refugees, so-called climate refugees. There's no refugee status. That's an extension of the word today in countries applying the Geneva Convention. The question is, should we do a preemptive, do we have a moral obligation to start thinking about it? Or what's a protection? Because if we would open the category, it would definitely create a pull factor. So the fact that the Geneva Convention is available induces Western African people to move to Europe and to ask for asylum, despite the fact that they're looking for a job and an income. So they're just using the wrong gate of entry. So already the current interpretation and application of the Geneva Convention leads to an overcrowding of the asylum system, and at least statistically makes it more difficult for genuine refugees to be treated by our system, because the system is overcrowded with people who would want to work here, who would never ask for asylum if they would not be said, look, this is the only gate of entry we're having. If you arrive in Lampedusa, there's no other way. You cannot say, I'm poor, but I have a degree in whatever, computing science, and I'm from Abuja, and now I want to work in Italy, or Italy is not my prime concern, I want to work in the UK, or because I'm already speaking English, like that. This is a non-starter in Lampedusa or on the Greek island or something like that. So the only possibility is that people are asking for asylum. Now in the future, they can say, yeah, but it's getting hotter in my village of origin. Yeah, I do not believe that this is something that will make our asylum system more fair or workable, at least in places where obviously it has difficulty. Plus, it's important to say that not only does UNHCR may not have enough money, they are not fighting for it. Yeah, the UNHCR, on the contrary, tries to make sure that the money goes to a narrower defined group of people who are inside their mandate. They are not advocating for expanding their mandate. Yeah, they're always happy with more money, I assume, because they can make use of it. In the past, UNHCR has not even asked to include the UNRWA work into its umbrella. Yeah, and UNRWA was set up in the 1940s because at that time, Palestinians, being non-Europeans, would never have qualified for refugee status because they were somehow outside the Geneva Convention as non-Europeans. Yeah, and that's the reason why we had two UN refugee institutions. Today, if you would never set up two agencies, one for the Palestinian and one for the rest of the world. It makes no sense. But when you see the institutional setup of the 1940s, it's obvious why we have two agencies and not one. And then the question is, if we play it through this, the vast majority of people who are refugees are not in Europe. So the vast majority of future climate-related migrants will not come to Europe. So the question is, there's other ways of engagement. First, you can prepare people and regions in a better way for climate change. So Bangladesh and the Netherlands are in the same situation. Yeah, a large part of their country is at or below sea level. Now, the Netherlands were nowhere on the maps that I've just shown. Why? Because we are assuming that if they have managed the last 500 years, they will manage the next 500 years. They're just adding to their dikes. In Bangladesh, there is no dikes. There's also no tradition. Already the Italians have difficulties in coming up with a sensible plan for the Lagoon of Venice. Yeah, so you see that's already inside Europe. It's a different traditions, and and the situation in Venice is easier than in the Netherlands because there is no big river. So the Brenta River is diverted since about 600 or 500 years to go around the lagoon. So normally it should be easier to protect Venice than to protect Rotterdam and Amsterdam. But in Italy, since 27 years now, there's a debate of how to do it. And probably a couple €100 million already invested in doing this. But when you go there, you see nothing. So Bangladesh is more on that side. So we assume they have no tradition. There's nothing in place. There's no local authority that would easily be able to create dikes and dams of the how you say Netherlands type. But this is a way of preventing. Yeah, you know the sea level is rising, and you protect yourself. That's possible. There's also, other possibilities that you are aware of. I'm not. I can just say so. But preparing. So prevention is one thing. That's probably the most difficult one. Yeah, just have burn less coal. Yeah, drive fewer cars. Don't buy an SUV. Use the train instead of the airplane. Don't eat meat, etc. Yeah, so that's a prevention side. There we can do a lot. But also other countries. Don't burn your rainforests. The second thing is helping people to adapt. And including climate-related migrants into the Geneva Convention is not a way of helping people to adapt. It should first start at home, because it will affect more people than we can ever take into Europe. And also, that's politically probably more sellable. So it's easier to convince our electorates that this should be done than having more refugees. And then helping people to relocate, because relocation does not necessarily mean moving to Europe or the US or Australia. So when you see, Indonesia has decided to move its capital, which is lost, or which is given up by the people because it's below sea level and they didn't have enough probably Dutch colonial rule in order to be able to just emulate the Dutch case. The Dutch did the same as they did at home. They created the capital of Indonesia, of their Dutch Southeast India below sea level. But so there the idea is we just move the capital to Borneo. So we could support this. Yeah, it would help people getting out of Jakarta and moving to other places. And there, Indonesia has a tradition because they think Java is overcrowded, the other islands are underpopulated. There's already a longer tradition of movement of people out of Java as part of a government policy. So there you could link to existing government routines, and establish traditions and say, look, your place is lost, it will be washed away, move out now before you get around tomorrow. And we could instrumental in that. That kind of relocation. The more pertinent question is, even catering to the needs of large amount of people. We have 1.2 billion people living in Africa today, 1.3 billion. It's going to be 4 billion at the end of the century. they live, most of this increase takes place in sub-Saharan Africa, and this is one of the parts of the world where everybody agrees will be most affected by climate change. And there the question is food production. How can we increase food security in areas? And there's a political dimension to it. So food insecurity in Guatemala has nothing to do with the infertility of the area or a lack of water, things like that. It's purely political. Yeah, it's gangs making life for farmers difficult. Yeah, I would assume the same in Congo. But the question is, shall we produce more food? So a turbo agri-production in Europe, and then we send the food to Africa? Or shall we help them to set up a European type of agriculture? Now, already today, international travel by air is responsible for 2.5% of all greenhouse gas emissions. Agriculture is responsible for 20%. If we would double or quadruple that avenue in order to create more food security, it would at the same time have probably a very detrimental effect on greenhouse gas emissions, which would then feed into more climate change instead of less. So also, you also need to think about sustainable solutions, which is, a very tricky thing. Because in Europe, we say maybe we're producing, I think 30% of the European food just gets thrown away or doesn't even reach the consumer, is just dumped. So we could have the same standard of living with about 30% or 50% less agriculture, most likely. But if we think we need to feed the rest of the world, then we can't go down that avenue. Or will there ever be a sustainable dairy farming in Senegal? Yeah, I don't know. These are questions that it's more up to you to decide, because you are, say, the climate research side of the wing. I'm just giving you an external reflection on what mitigation could mean. Yeah. So helping resettle, helping relocate, helping to adapt, prevention, this is on the to-do list. And I would start on that angle before trying to change the Geneva Convention, in my view. But that's just, a practitioner's view. Yeah?
I'm just worried that
You need a mic.
The problem is that if we don't recognize this category of people from a legal point of view,
yes,
then states will not have any legal obligations to provide any kind of assistance or any kind of prevention or helping in adaptation and helping these people to relocate, I think. So it's just a duty of assistance what we're doing.
So your argument is we need to create more migration pressure onto Europe in order to make it easier for us to finance the prevention?
No. My argument is that if we don't include climate refugees or whatever we want to call this category of people into whatever legal framework, so if we don't, let's say, provide a sort of status of rights, then states, like European states in particular, have no legal obligations to provide, any kind of help, any kind of assistance, any kind of protection, or whatever they could do to help those people to adapt and to relocate. This is my question. So.
I'm sorry. I'm not convinced because.
Can I add to that? I think there's a basic dilemma here. So in the OSD, 20 years ago, the lowest unemployment rate was found in Mexico, which was very surprising. But the reason is that they don't have an unemployment insurance program, so there's no point in register as unemployed. But then people think like Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman said, if you set up a program to support single mothers, you can be damn sure that you get a lot of single mothers. So I think this is what is sort of guiding the thinking of policymakers in Europe and elsewhere, that they fear that if they set up a program of whatever kind, I mean, not necessarily of bringing people to Europe, even if there are those who want that too, but if you set up a program, you will simply sort of magnify the number of people who claim that they are climate refugees, and you set up, or you create problems of managing these kinds of programs. So I think if one wants to address this with a particular policy, I think it really demands a clever design, in order to convince policymakers that this is a way forward that will not sort of magnify the issue, but rather be sort of targeted at the right people.
Yeah, personally, I would advocate against opening that category because it's not an issue today. You don't see climate refugees lining up in Sweden today. Yeah? It's not a reality. And if you say we need to prepare for tomorrow, the danger is, as none of the neighboring countries of Sweden will be affected negatively to the extent that you would need to create categories for Finns or Norwegians trying to escape from the horrors of climate change. It could only people who are very far away. Now, but the Geneva Convention doesn't mean that you resettle people across the planet. The idea is that you give them protection in the neighborhood. Initially, this is why most refugees live next to the country where they come from. So that having Syrians in Sweden is an exception. Yeah, and Sweden has a long humanitarian tradition of accepting refugees, but most of these refugees would not need to be accepted in Sweden because they have traveled through secure countries before arriving in Sweden, obviously. Yeah, and so if a country like Sweden or Australia opens up a category climate refugee, you can be pretty sure that people will try to go through that gate of entry, and it will become you would need a huge apparatus to determine whether the claim is warranted or not. Yeah, and I'm saying it might be easier to invest the political capital and the money that would go along with such a program in order to make life more secure in places where people are living now, because you would reach more people. As it is today, almost all refugees live outside Europe, the US, and Australia. Yeah, they live near the area of conflict, and it's also much cheaper to give them a livelihood in a place like Kenya or Ethiopia or Uganda than it is to finance it over here. That has to do with the cost of living per capita. But this doesn't preclude to have a legal or moral or ethical debate about the issue that you're raising. But I think that's another discussion. I'm making just a practical argument.
You started out this talk by pointing to the fact that our usual categories and concepts are not designed to describe and analyze this increasing phenomenon of climate-related displacement. So apparently there is a need to also produce statistics and on a regular basis that can adequately describe the challenges to human security or other kinds of vulnerabilities, food security or whatever, in order to mobilize resources internationally. So you need to have some kind of conceptual clarity to describe the program and also maybe to have policies, but not necessarily as paragraphed in the Geneva Convention, but something that can attract more attention to real human problem.
Yeah, I think that's what I was hoping for. This is why I was bringing these maps. I mean, it would be up to you, to the climate researchers. I mean, you're a political scientist, but to the climate researchers, to look at these maps or other data you're having, and to try to understand, or give me an understanding, or give yourself an understanding, what part of this displacement that you're seeing on these maps has to do with climate change, and what part has to do with other things. Yeah. when you recall just for a second the map that I have shown about Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, where is it because terrorists are making life so difficult for farmers that they cannot farm? Where is it that herders and farmers are struggling over the same water resources or wet or grazelands or something like that? Where is it that you just have an incompetent government? Where is it that the dumping of European surpluses onto markets by benevolent NGOs destroys local markets and makes life for farmers untenable because there's too many do-gooders in Europe or in the US, something like that. So, I mean, it's a complex situation that you're having. Why we're getting food scarcity and then displacement because of food scarcity, or no displacement because of food scarcity because people just die, they're too weak to walk, things like that. So I think that it would warrant to take a closer look, and then a migration researcher could come in and give you the migration dimension. But I think it would be, you need a better understanding on the ground before you can make the argument. What is climate related? And also when you have a better understanding of the institutional shortcomings, to understand what would it take to have mitigation. Do we need a different government? Do we need to stop NGOs distributing food for free? Do we need to, whatever, do we need better irrigation? Do we need to fight the terrorists first? Or I don't know, something like that. So when you want to come up with a strategy, you need to have a broader picture than just look at displacement. Displacement is an indicator that something is wrong. But it's very difficult for somebody like me who just gets the information and sees the number of people displaced to exactly say what went wrong or what mix of things went wrong and what's the easiest to pull a plug or to put something like that. That's a conversation one would need between the migration researchers and the political analysts and climate scientists like you. That's the invitation. That's what we would need to come down when we want to break down global figures into concrete situations. Like I was showing, a heat wave in India doesn't lead to any international migration, not even to local displacement. Yeah, monsoon floods immediately displacement, 1.6 million people within 2 weeks. So different types of nature be hitting, both related to climate change, in my view. A full-fledged war in Kashmir would immediately lead to displacement of millions of people within days. Between India and Pakistan, absolutely not related to climate change. It has nothing to do with the melting of the Siachen glacier at the border between India and Pakistan, or the line of control where it borders China. Just to give you three things on the same subcontinent where at least the migration researcher would have an answer. But then to say what's the dimension in Western Africa is more difficult. I don't have a clear vision how much of this, what I have shown, would be. And also, I don't know enough about the region. One would need really to have more intelligence on the ground too. But what I can do as a migration researcher is to count numbers and to try to give an analytical grid. But the impact, the job of the climate science people would be to disentangle the other side. And then we would need political analysts who see this is this group, political group, and there's that political group, and they are getting their arms from Russia, and they are getting their arms via Libya from, I don't know, the Tuaregs, and these are people who are linked to Qatar and, are financed out of the madrasas around Timbuktu or something like that. It's a different layer, but also, would contribute to the understanding why you have a protracted situation in that area. Okay.
Thank you. Okay. You have a
small start. You present figures that have been gathered by UNHCR on refugee-related migration, and there's a long tradition of counting, and this counting really matters in terms of the political debate. And then you cite various other kinds of sources in order to come up with numbers on disasters and conflicts. And wouldn't it be important to have a UN numbers on these issues, because if UN takes responsibility and set up a statistical function that can count these people, that would be one way of putting these challenges on the agenda. It would be a small step, but I think a small step in the right direction.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I would have money, I would just start with the Geneva-based internal displacement monitoring center and tell them, as UNHCR is doing this for conflict internationally, would you see a way of counting people who are displaced across borders because of natural disasters? This would be step one. Regardless of could also be a tsunami or something like that, because they have this category in nature. But then we know that 95% of this nature is climate related.
Excellent, thank you. Do we have any other question? Okay, well, thank you so much. This has been super interesting to listen to, very enlightening, and has given us a lot of food for thought and things to address in our research to come. And thanks for the comments as well. That's very good, and helped us to have a very enlightening and reflective debate here. So thank you so much.
Thank you.